afternoon. I want to welcome you here to the Stimson Center. I'm Alan Romberg, Director of the East Asia program here, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce as our speaker today, Professor Hunan Wang, who is going to talk, as you know, about actually a pair of very important subjects that he's pulling together. One is the U.S. PRC relationship, which he's talking about pessimism, and then the question about how this impacts on Taiwan and whether Taiwan can take advantage of disruptions or difficulties in U.S. PRC relations. Both of these elements, in my view, are really quite important not only to the mainland and Taiwan, but to the United States. Sorry, I have an alarm going off. This is, as you know, it's been a very difficult time in U.S. PRC relations, but we're about to have a summit meeting in Beijing, in Hangzhou, where one hopes, but maybe overly optimistic to hope too much, that at least the tone of U.S. PRC relations can be brought down a bit from where it has been in the last few months. I think actually right now it's not as bad as it has been, but I don't think any of the fundamental issues have been resolved either. And we know there's also a very difficult situation across the strait where the relatively new, now 100-day-old administration of President Taiwan and the government under President Xi Jinping have not found a formula for maintaining stability in that relationship. So all of that comes into play. These are all important relationships. The goal would be obviously to maintain stability, to have as constructive relationships in all of, if you could put it, in all three legs of the triangle as possible. But I think Dr. Wang will point out to us that this is not always easy, and will help guide us in thinking about how we might make our way forward. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Hunan Wang from Taiwan, Chung Kung University. Is that pronounced close enough?
Chung
Kung University in Tainan, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. And I saw some old friends here, some of my interviews here. Today, I'm going to present this topic, as you can see from the screen. It's about rising pessimism about China-U.S. relationship with the subtitle, Will Taiwan benefit or not? This is kind of a research project partly based on my own research interest, which is also cooperated with another Taiwanese scholar, Zhi Yushi, in National Taiwan University, and also partly based on interviews with various experts, researchers, former diplomats, practitioners, and academic scholars that I conducted this summer here at Washington, D.C. So therefore, I want to use this time to thank everyone who sacrificed some of their time to talk with me. Probably they have repeated the same point elsewhere before talking to me. And I especially want to thank Alan Romberg for his unselfish sharing of his personal networks with me. Last, also thanks to Hannah Randolph and Antonio Liao for their assistance during my stay here at the Stimson Center. So today, I want to talk about the impact of rising pessimism about the Sino-U.S. relationship especially in light of this summer's South China Sea ruling by International Tribunal. My argument here is I think this kind of a relationship, which is currently viewed as deteriorating, should not require an immediate aid or a harsher approach to China for the sake of Americans' based national interests, despite belief of many US scholars or experts that a tougher policy is required in order to respond China's more and more assertive behaviors or actions. Instead, I believe that a policy of self-restraint, I will explain later, or no action in the short term should be beneficial. So in the following probably 20 minutes or less than 20 minutes, I will go through the following 4 sections, as you can see from the screen. The first is what I call as worry caused by the incongruent view on relationality, the term I will explain later, between America and China. The second part I will go through trust in the fulfillment role and trust in the ability to cause harm. In the third part, I will discuss whether a perceived deteriorating relationship can or cannot encourage a policy of patience. Finally, Taiwan is one of very important examples of a state actor that is very much concerned about Sino-U.S. relationship. So the question about whether Taiwan can benefit from a deteriorating Sino-U.S. relationship will be discussed in the end. Regarding the relationship between China and the United States, I acknowledge that most of the experts that I interviewed this summer expressed strong concerns. Perhaps the term of worry is the best term to describe about their concerns about the future relations between the two countries, especially on the heels of China's dogmatic response to the South China Sea ruling. I heard different reasons for these concerns and different views for how Washington should adjust its China policy. In some cases, their views found support from, for example, Harry Harding's recent articles about has U.S.-China policy failed. Similarly, David Shambaugh has commented on the atmosphere of this pessimism toward and disillusion with China among think tanks in Washington. I am very sure that you are aware of their comments, and therefore I will not repeat them or go into details about those comments. But I will mention 2 important ideas that I took from my interviews for future analytical purposes. There are ideas of relationality. This term is kind of a much more abstract term to describe how certain type of state relationship is constituted and connected. And the second idea is about trust. I will explain more later. So we will talk about these 2 ideas first, and then go through how these 2 ideas they actually interact with each other to influence the state of patience in U.S.-China policy. So as you can see, the point 101, I conceptualize the relationality in 2 types. So on the one hand, you have this American or Western view on relationality. On the other hand, you have a Chinese view of relationalities. So it can actually, they cause inclusions conditions, so they kind of cause confrontations, cause different views with each other. So let me look at this first, American and the general Western view of relationality. This is kind of a relationality I found among nation states reflects the process in which each state practices certain values, norms, and issues. In turn, this type of Western view, or I call American view of relationality, kind of emphasize this practice strengthen the degree of relationality that links certain groups of nation states in the long run. And the obligations tied to community practices affect the ways that the newcomers, in this case China, interact with the established community and its rules. So as someone pointed out, between 1972 Nixon visit to China and the 1978 normalization of relations, the United States changed its long-standing policy of isolating China to one of engagement, integration, and assistance. In my view, I think this change represented an effort from the US side to bring China into an existing community of practices with an expectation that China would willingly accept those practices and act accordingly so as to maintain relationship with the entire community as well as the relationship with the United States. So that's about American view of relationality. So we will kind of keep this in mind on the one hand. And on the other hand, one point to point out the Chinese view of relationality is basically bilateral and ontological issues. Different from this American view of relationality, it is basically multilateral in nature. So one is multilateral, one is more bilateral view from the Chinese side. So how to explain this? Actually, Chinese kind of tends to treat relationality, I mean this is spatial term to describe a particular relationship with the other part as an ontological issues. That means, according to traditional Chinese thinking, I won't go into details, but you can find many Chinese IR scholars, they found the roots in traditional Chinese classics to explain this nature. So this ontological view from the Chinese side kind of treat all nations and the non-nation states are bound to be related with each other. Therefore, it isn't necessary for them, I mean for those nation states, to be related through practice. It is not necessary. In the modern times, China's relations with others are based on the sovereignty system, with both China and the United States being parts of a larger self. It's called Chinese 大我. What does that mean? Greater self in English. It's kind of close to a collective identity sense shared by China and its counterparts, because it's always bilateral. So you can see China as this foreign policy approach tended to be always talk bilaterally instead of join multilateral framework. So that's another issue. But anyway, in this larger self, China assumed that, both China and its counterparts, such as the United States, would be enjoying equal levels of sovereign powers in this greater self or collective community sense. Therefore, if the United States tries to interfere with China's sovereignty from the Chinese view, that would be considered as an attempt to destroy a greater self. In turn, would also strongly affect the United States itself. So after we see these two contrasting views, then we go to 1.3. I believe that both American view on relationality and Chinese view on relationality have created ambiguous or incongruent situations that prevent each side from showing patience, because they just want to solve the problem as soon as possible, or in a short time to clarify such ambiguity. Therefore, encouraging both countries to believe that taking immediate action is generally a preferred policy. So let me give you one example. According to the American view on relation entity, when international rules or international values become internalized, the individual parties or the superpowers, such as the United States itself, maybe believe that it has a duty to enforce international rules and values among those who have neither a history of them nor a willingness to practice them. But according to the Chinese view of relation entity, since all nations are perceived as related with each other in the beginning, they must accept responsibility for maintaining or defending the large collective identity within a sovereign system. So how can we resolve these confrontations due to the two different contrasting views on relation entities? I will go into details later for this point. Now we are moving to the section of trust. As you can see from the screen, actually more than one interviewee mentioned to me this metaphor. It's about Thucydides' trap. It's a reminder of how structural stress and wars are hard to avoid when the rising power threatens a status quo power. So you probably already know this metaphor. However, when my interviewees were asked to comment on South China Sea case, most gave non-power reasons why American people are concerned about Chinese assertiveness in Asia. In my point of view, I think their answers regarding the non-power reasons kind of reduce the potential for trust, because Chinese assertiveness is viewed by some U.S. experts as harming the responsibility that a responsible state should maintain regarding role expectations for China. So that's the reason why I wrote about role expectation for China, because from their answers we can have this sense. Actually, they have a strong role expectations how China should behave. According to this idea, the United States, or probably those interviewees that I conducted, believe that China should understand on its own what kinds of decisions and actors it should take in support of good relations. The idea also explains the unhappiness I heard from most of my interviewees regarding the Chinese government's rejection of the South China Sea ruling from The Hague. Let's see some example here. So it's one of my interviewees told me that the reason why the United States is not happy about China's response to the South China Sea ruling is because the Chinese government's behavior reflects an attitude of rejection and irreverence. Such attitude makes Americans feel that China is still that undemocratic country that they have always had in mind. So that's kind of one answer from my interview. Another one from another interview told me that what the United States and China's neighboring countries are disappointed about is not what China claims, but how China has responded. So that's I think that's relevant to my role expectations for China's behavior. So this is the first type of trust that I gathered from my interviews. There are second type of trust also revealed by my interviewees. This type of trust actually involves, as you can see 1.2 here, that involves one party's belief that another party has the ability to do harm to its interests. Some interviews commented on how the U.S. has treated China as a major threat in Asia, despite their acknowledgement that China does not pose any immediate threat to the United States. So here's another example from my interview. This person told me that since 2012, I have found that China has shown many aggressive behaviors or actions that actually challenge Americans' national interests. According to the so-called American national interests, the U.S. cannot tolerate a hostile power in Asia. Perhaps China is not reaching that level of hostility now, but no one knows if China will do so in the future. So to sum up, I think the question of whether China actually has enough power to challenge the United States is less important than how such capacity is interpreted in a way that causes mistrust between United States and China. So as you can see, the second type of trust is very different from the first type of trust, which based on raw identities. The second one is based on one party's judgment about changes in the other party's material power, whether it is objective or subjective. In my view, regardless of which type of trust is involved in the Sino-U.S. relationship, I think as long as trust continues to be lost on the U.S. side, it will eventually reach a balance of power strategy threshold as perceived by those policymakers in Washington, D.C. So that's about two types of trust in my research project that I found. I will now move to another section. It's about the idea of patience. That's actually what I'm working with. It's a research project working with another professor, Shi Zhiyu, in Taiwan. After we reviewing U.S. views on relationalities and trust or mistrust, I believe that either self-restraint or no action on disputed issues is an option that should be considered as equally valid as tough responses that most U.S.-China experts suggest. In my view, self-restraint, no action, or tougher approach will affect different states of patience. So as you can see from here, table 1, I kind of make it for the analytical purposes. So I divide the different views about relationality on the left side, and the above side is trust. I divide trust and mistrust. So you can get actually, you see the gray area. That's kind of the current U.S.-China policy with very low patience. For example, such as balance of power thinking, and median patience, integration or engagement. And I think right now we need to expand this U.S.-China policy to also include the blue area to make adjustment or to explain this narrowly defined U.S.-China policy. But how should we do this? I think there are two ways to explain this gray area, moving to the blue area. The first thing we need to do, just go back to the first thing, 1.1 points out, the first thing we need to do is to build up this mutuality. That's kind of another term. It's an abstract term, but it tries to describe the process or the abstract to describe this spatial type of bilaterally adjusted relationship between China and the United States. So in that sense, actually, this adjusted relationship has to be bilaterally, has to be mutually constituted and formulated by the two actors who cannot be ontologically independent. This is very close to the Chinese form of relationality that involves great self that I just mentioned about. That means a collective community sense shared by these two great countries. However, what's different from the Chinese view is that this type of mutual relationality allows a degree of incongruity to exist between actors for the moment, only for the moment, but to be modified later via each other's decision-making process. So what is good about this suggestion, to make to build up the mutuality? I think the good thing about this is such incongruity may not be easily resolved or understood in the short term, but that's okay. Therefore, a policy of patience is needed until better conditions emerge. So that's kind of the reason why we need a policy of patience in US-China policies. Then, after 1.1, after we build up this mutuality between the United States and China, another thing I want to say about is the second factor to promote this, to explain this US-China policy is to talk about, to emphasize the idea of trust. Trust is the most important aspect of producing a policy of patience, since it entails one actor's ability to tolerate uncertainties so as to prevent from increasing affecting a sense of mutual relationalities that I proposed in the first point. So as I mentioned earlier, for example, U.S. trust in its relations with China involve certain role expectations. Showing trust in China, as we understand, become a one-way obligation would be very easily interpreted by the Chinese side as an American-centric intrusion on Chinese sovereignty. As long as the U.S. fails to maintain a high level of first kind of trust toward China, it is very likely for the United States to emphasize a balance of power strategy. I don't think that's a good thing, right? If the United States go back to this balance of power strategy or consciousness. So I think we need to change this one-way trust obligation toward from one side to another side, or even from China to US this direction. So trust in a mutual relationality must be a two-way direction. So that means this is a trust that obligates both actors to exercise self-restraint on issues that seem unresolvable in the short term. Furthermore, trust between China and the United States has to be built upon personal relationships, as I suggest for 1.2. This is the idea that I learned from one of my interviewees who actually served in the George W. Bush administrations when launching a strategic economic dialogue between China and the United States. Finally, the Taiwan issue. I'm here to offer 3 parts of a whole Taiwan-US story. Generally speaking, I think Taiwan only benefits in the first part, only benefits in the first scenario, but may lose its interests in the rest 2 parts. How can I say that? In the first part, Taiwan is a small state that benefit from its position as an, I call epistemological equal. So actually it's a position equally in an American-led community, even though it is not a fully recognized nation state. the reason Taiwan has such a status in the American-led global community is that traditional state attributes such as material power do not fully apply to Taiwan. In my opinion, that means Taiwan benefits from its willingness to practice liberal democracy, free markets, and autonomy in its civil society. This is why Taiwan was once described by George W. Bush as a beacon of democracy to Asia and the world. So, in my view, I think Taiwan will remain an example of how small state diplomacy can still work when it is based on shared rules, norms, and values. So that's the first part of U.S.-Taiwan story. The second part of the story is that it is the asymmetrical power relationships that gives the United States power to exert control over actions taken by Taiwanese government. One of my interviews described that U.S. appreciation for new Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen's promise to maintain the status quo in cross-strait relations. But he or she also mentioned the likelihood of Washington immediately asserting itself should Tsai Ing-wen argue that the status quo means the same as Taiwan independence. If this is true, in my view, this kind of a view re-establish Taiwan's status as a small power to be used as part of America's grand strategies and not as an equal in the first story. The last part of the whole story is the potential of U.S. policymakers to take harsher actions toward Taiwan should they believe that doing so will prevent further damage to U.S.-China relationships. So here I write down this term is America's balance of relationship with China. What does that mean? We kind of have this belief that the U.S. may have an intention to balance China's rising power, right? But what is also true, in my view, is the idea of balance of relationship in American policymakers' mind. That means the United States will simply not let Taiwan negatively affect Sino-U.S. relationship because the United States want to make this balanced relationship with China, with mainland China. In summary, I think it would be dangerous for decision makers in Taipei to misjudge Americans' grand strategy for maintaining balance of power with China. And I think it is in the best interests for Taiwan to maintain its autonomy by not claiming dependence upon any great power, or to maintain predictable relations with both mainland China and the United States in order to retain flexibility for dealing with either side. To be honest, I'm not sure where is the Sino-U.S. relationship or Taiwan-U.S. relationship ultimately leading to. But I will just stop here and I will take questions from the audience. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we see, are there any questions to start with from the audience? We have a microphone, so if you would come here. Put your hand up now so you can. And could you identify yourself, please, and your affiliation?
Nadia Chao from Liberty Times, Taiwan. Thank you for your analysis. I think from your recommendation to the U.S. side, I just have a question. Although this, seems to be adopted already or executed by the U.S. policymaker for decades, but it doesn't really change, the trajectory of the U.S.-China policy. So I'm just wondering, will this make any difference if they follow? I haven't really seen, anything new, a new approach, because trying to build up like a mutuality or, common interest, trust, that's something people are talking about and actually doing for a long time. The second question, and then how do you evaluate the current Taiwan and the U.S. relation? Do you think Taiwan's government is doing the right thing now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. They are very good questions and very difficult to answer. The first question is about, I think you tried to say you didn't see any nuance in my analysis. I think my intention is to try to solve the perceived confrontation between the United States and mainland China. Especially this perception just occurred probably after 2010, because there is a strong sense in Washington, D.C. or among some U.S.-China experts since 2010, they have this perceived assertiveness from the Chinese side. But as you can know, the Chinese people, they always offer different reasons or explanation to say, no, they are not assertive, they are not being assertive. They are being perceived assertive because the other parts, such as Philippines or Vietnam or United States, you go first to have these assertive behaviors. So they explain to each other, they know their each other's justifications quite well. But as you can see, if the United States still use its old way to understand Chinese people, Chinese government, or Chinese behaviors, that's kind of what you point out is kind of nothing changed in U.S.-China policies, right? Because it kind of used the same attitude as if United States treated with, for example, like another rising policy such as Japan in 1980s, or it's another big enemies in the Cold War. So that's kind of the continuities. You are right. We can see these always try to find a rising power as a big challenge to the United States because of some IR theories or structural reasons. You can explain that. But I kind of try to solve these confrontations in very theoretical sense to see actually the fundamental problems between the two countries so hard to understand with each other. It's not about their explanations. It's not about language, right? They can speak English with each other. They can communicate with each other. They have a high-level communications between officials, but they still have ups and downs relationship. If we go back to the past 40 years, it's always ups and downs, ups and downs. So I think, especially I feel this sense that most of the interviews I conducted, they try to call for tougher responses from the Washington, D.C. To China's rising power, or you can say to China's rising assertive behavior in the South China Sea or in East Asia. And I think that kind of show this losing patience among the China experts. And it's also reflect if those policymakers in Washington, D.C., they finally listen to those China experts among those think tanks, probably they will do more aggressive responses or harsher responses in the new American government. I don't think that's a good thing, because that means the United States will go back to the traditional balance of power strategies. So let me give you another example. So I think to show if you have patience or you don't have patience. For example, I think United States have a good patience with Cuba, right? United States just wait for the condition, good condition or better condition emerge. So the Obama administration can probably finally realize that the conditions being good, then we can deal with the situations to improve the relationship between the United States and Cuba. But how about Iraq? Because the United States lose patience, so United States try to respond immediately. So that's the reason kind of caused the United States to intervene Iraq, and right now kind of push the whole United States, cannot leave the Middle East. That's kind of an example of how U.S. policy losing patience, on certain areas. So that's kind of how I worry about it. I hope I answered your first questions. And the second question you mentioned about how do I define or think about the current Taiwan-U.S. relationship, especially under this new government. I think so far so good. That's all I can say. It's only 2 months, and we know that the new government, its popularity, according to its popularity just dropped. So I think we can just wait. We can have patience, for this new government. But I mean, so far so good, because Tsai Ing-wen, he's not the traditional DPP politician. So we understand that she needs to deal with those deep green voices in Taiwan, and so that's the reason why she did not actually directly reject 92 consensus. But on the other hand, I know she also wants to appease the United States, or maybe that's the wrong word. Or she tried to make the balance. I think she tried to make a balance between different ideologies. So far, I think that's the best she can do to maintain a good relationship, not only with the United States, but also with mainland China. Yeah.
All right. Microphone, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wang. My name is Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And I'm wondering if you have any evaluation of the significance of the role that Taiwan could play in the U.S. strategy of the Asia Pacific in a different scenario of the presidency. If Hillary Clinton is elected or Donald Trump is elected, what kinds of impact on the Taiwan's role in the U.S. strategy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very tough question. You give me 2 scenarios, right? The second one, I really cannot say anything about if Trump elected. I was told by one of my interviewees that only under 2 conditions. I think he's not here today. Under 2 conditions, Mr. Trump will win the election. One is Mrs. Clinton was assassinated by someone. And the second situation is there is going to be another 9/11 tragedy in New York. So that's 2 conditions. Mr. Trump will win the election. So probably I don't talk about this second scenario. But how about the first scenario? That I think Mrs. Clinton looking quite good right now, according to the public poll, right? So I think she's doing very well. She got a very good chance to win the election. So I mean, we probably have this consensus. Not only me, I think probably also amongst those think tanks here. If Mr. Clinton won the elections, it's very highly possible. It's very highly likely that improve or enforce a pivot to Asia policy. So that means I think that's kind of, I think in theory, that increase Taiwan's political or diplomatic role, not to mention economic role in the regime in the Asia Pacific. And so that means I think the United States government will be much more friendly toward Taiwan and welcome Taiwan to play constructive or active role in the regime. But what does that mean, constructive and active role in the regime? In my own opinion, I think it's better for the China-U.S. government or to the new government, to DP government, try to emphasize. First of all, the new government should put much emphasis on the domestic economic issues. It would give China-U.S. a stable mandate to deal with Taiwan's relationship with neighboring countries, including mainland China. However, if China-U.S. loses its mandate in domestic politics, which kind of mainly based on the new government's economic performance, then I don't think China-U.S. will have any voice or influence in the regime. So that's the first thing I think the new government in Taiwan need to focus on about the economic issue, economic performance in current Taiwan society. And the second, in terms of its cross-strait relation policy or its foreign policy, I think probably should better, in my opinion, should better to learn from Ma Ying-jeou, its previous, the previous President Ma Ying-jeou's peace policy. We know that President Ma Ying-jeou promoted two different types of peace policy. One is in East China Sea, another is in South China Sea. But probably there's not so much, or not sufficient theoretical supporting for Ma Ying-jeou's theories. So I think Taiwan can still pursue this peace policy, but the new government need to think more about how to sell this new, what's the substance of this peace policy in the regime, can play in the regime or can play in the cross-strait relations. I know my answer probably is very abstract, probably you are not satisfied, but I mean that's kind of the direction I suggest for the new government in Taiwan. They can think about the peace policy in the regime, but they need to figure out how to formulate it, how to articulate it. That's for the international or the cross-strait relations. And domestically, they need to emphasize economic performance. So that's the two important things.
No, it's coming to you.
Hi, I'm Ken Scalvin from CSIS. I just want to ask about the South China Sea issue. So what kind of development do you predict in the future, especially after G20? Because some experts said the PRC government will be more aggressive after success of G20. So how do you comment on such view? And the second question is, what kind of action Taiwan government will or should not take on such on this South China Sea issue?
Thank you very much. They are very two good questions. I think the second one is much difficult for me to answer about Taiwan's role. But let's think about the first one about what will happen after 2020s. I think at least from the American side, I feel that most people I interviewed, they kind of agree that the South China Sea dispute is just one small part of Sino-U.S. relationship. So I think that's probably the reason why can explain to, I mean that's kind of reason can explain to actually the United States kind of hold some hesitation to respond or to criticize China's behaviors in the first time. So that's kind of a good thing to show the patience, right? But however, I know that the United States have a strong argument about this freedom of navigation point. But on the Chinese side, I think they are still waiting for the new election result for the next years. In theory, I think, in my theory, I think the Chinese government, they have more patience than that of the United States, U.S. government. That's kind of my observations. So I don't think they try to deal with this issue immediately. Especially, I think it's nothing about G20 actually, but G20 at least kind of construct a good atmosphere between China and those major powers in the world. That's a good starting point. But the fundamental disputes cannot be solved overnight, right? So I think, according to my observations, I think that's kind of, I think the Chinese approach is to go back to bilateral dialogue between China and the disputed counterparts, such as Philippines or Vietnam. So I mean those Southeast Asia countries, not directly to be negotiating with the United States. Yeah. So I think they will wait for the new government from the U.S. side. And about Taiwan's role in this part. Because right now we have the new government in Taiwan, we have this new South China policy. I don't know how to translate it. It's 新南向政策, new South China policy. So that means the new government in Taiwan try to avoid dealing with Chinese government and then directly to make good relationship with those Southeast Asia countries. I'm not optimistic about the results actually, because I think those Southeast Asia countries, they are very sensitive to the confrontations between mainland China and Taiwan. So even if those Southeast Asia countries, such as Philippines or Vietnam, they have the South China Sea disputes with mainland China, but that does not mean they will have more willingness to cooperate with the new government in Taiwan. It's different things. So that's kind of the conclusion of my presentation today. Taiwan can benefit from its role in practicing those shared values, universal values. That's okay, that's fine for the United States. But if Taiwan tries to take advantage of the perceived deteriorating relationship between mainland China and the United States, it will be miscalculations or will be very dangerous. I know some people here disagree about this conclusion, but that's kind of my observations. So that means what Taiwan can play is very hard if you don't try to maintain a stable or constructive relationship with mainland China. It's really hard for Taiwan to play any constructive role in the Asia Pacific region. But please don't make me wrong. I'm not saying that the new Taiwan government should always rely on the goodness from the mainland China. I'm not saying that. But at least I think the new government need to find a new way, not the current approach to mainland China, but a new way to try to improve the current situation between Taiwan and the mainland China. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Chia Ching from United Daily News, Taiwan Media. So you just mentioned a new way, but Tsai refuses to say the 92 consensus. So I don't know if you have a new way for her. And there's and the second question is, recently there's a Chinese scholar says that China will take force to Taiwan in 2021, year 2021. So take that as a prediction or a message to Taiwan? Shouldn't we take some actions instead of being patient?
Thank you very much. About the first question, if I have any suggestion for President Tsai Ing-wen, if not, if I were her to put it in the same positions, I think it's very hard, right? Because you need to kind of listen to those supporters of the pro-independence people within the DPP parties. But for me, I think the better strategy is to not to admit, but to, I think at least you need to be perceived by the Chinese government. You are willing to talk about 92 consensus. That's at least that's the starting point. That you cannot say that that was a policy made between KMT government and mainland China, the Chinese government. You cannot just say that. You cannot just say it's just a historical fact. I don't think that's fair for the previous government. Because right now you are the president of Republic of China, you know. As long as you accept these positions, you need to take, even that's the burden from the previous government. Then, after you accept this 92 consensus, I think there's much room for you to negotiate with those people from mainland China, right? Because even Tsai Ing-wen herself labeled her as an expert of negotiation, right? I usually heard about, she labeled herself, she was very competent in his negotiation skills. So I don't think she should be afraid of negotiation with people who from mainland China, even in the framework of 92 consensus. For your second questions, the Chinese scholar Jin Canlong, right, from Renmin University, just mentioned about this the Chinese strategy to use military force to take Taiwan probably by 2021. I think usually the Chinese scholars, they can have this, usually they have much room to talk about their opinions. I mean, they can show more proactive positions on Taiwan issues. But I think because he has this, he has very close relationship with the party, so I think that's kind of a signal something. I don't know if he was, I mean, this Professor Jin was told by the central government to talk about these things in the public or not, but that kind of give you a signal that try to push the current new government in Taiwan, even the Tsai Ing-wen herself, you know, to go back to the so-called normal relationship between mainland China and Taiwan. That means to accept 92 consensus. So I think that's kind of a signal to warn her to go back to the perceived bilateral relationship. I think that's a signal, yeah. So maybe you can take it as a joke because some people say it's impossible for mainland China to take Taiwan by force in a short time. But I think that, I mean, the people in the new government should take it seriously. And I think they need to find a way to have people in mainland China to try to, you know, have more updated information. So what does that mean from this professor? Because this person is not a professor alone. He actually have very close connections with the parties. Yeah.
Just to follow.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
So I don't think people in Taiwan take it as a joke. We take it seriously. So
they don't take it as a joke, but they ignore. I think that most people ignore this statement by Professor Jin. That's my opinion.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so my second question was, should Taiwan take some actions instead of being patient?
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of taking action doesn't mean only the China-Taiwan relations. It means maybe Taiwan should do something to the U.S.-Taiwan relations.
Yeah. You can have a positive action or have a negative action, right? And but it's really hard to define if your action actually cause positive results or negative results or not. But I know what you are trying to talking about. Probably you try to encourage me to say that Taiwan probably need to improve Taiwan-U.S. relationship first, right? In order to respond to this no dialogue relationship between Taiwan, mainland China and Taiwan. But as I just mentioned about Taiwan can benefit a lot from practicing those international values such as democracy, human rights, liberal society. That's kind of what expected role from the United States. I mean, the role the United States expect Taiwan to play in its grand strategies. So as long as, as long as Taiwan, the new government still, doing it well in those shared various democratic issues, that kind of make a good contrasting example for the United States. To talk to people in mainland China and tell them that you see Confucianism can be a good combination with liberal democracy, can be a good combination with liberal market capitalism. So that's kind of the United States expect. So that probably that's most of Taiwan can do, to keep practicing what it fulfill right now. Yeah. That kind of the answer. But for the details, you need to have different policies, to fulfill these roles.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Wong. I'm Janice Chen with the DPP office here in DC. And thank you so much for this very thorough explication of the theoretical framework that you've worked on. I was particularly fascinated by your description of the incongruent views of relationality between the U.S. and China. And I was just thinking that, on some level you could actually use that to describe the current state of cross-strait relations, that there's different views about how the relationship, the basis of the relationship. And so maybe that's what leads to your same prescription of patience, on Taiwan's part as well, and giving time to build up mutuality and practice mutuality. But I'm actually more curious, since we started talking about the U.S. strategy in the region generally, and also Taiwan's possible role in that, whether you've tried to maybe started trying to take this theoretical framework and look at how it might also apply to China's relationship with its neighbors in the region. That is, whether their views of relationality are maybe more congruent between China and its neighbors versus the U.S., and also what is the status of trust between China and its neighbors in the region.
Mm-hmm. So it's not a question, right?
It is. Whether you've thought about that at all or not, that's okay. But just in light of the new southbound policy and also the U.S. strategy.
I think it's a very good question in terms that we also found that it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, because China has tried many efforts to show its goodness toward neighboring countries. Even for Taiwan during the Manchu administration, so we know this compromise policy, 让利政策, right? That's kind of a very traditional approach or strategy from the Chinese government. What does that mean? It always used this bilateral relationship, and in this bilateral relationship, China always unilaterally to make consensus. Most of them are economic consensus to the counterparts. And that's kind of the Chinese belief that as long as they make unilateral concession, unilateral compromise in the beginning, then they can expect reciprocal responses from the counterparts. However, it's kind of very frustrating if we see the results. Many countries, they are getting more and more worried about China's taking advantage of their, for example, economic relationship or other political or diplomatic relations. So, for example, the Chinese government, they have this program. Probably many of you know that One Belt, One Road. But after this, in the beginning, the neighboring countries welcome this new project. It's mostly about the financial support issues. But right now, if you see those discourses or the discussion, media discussions in, for example, in Thailand, in Vietnam, or in Philippines, especially Thailand, I just view the articles, I just read the articles. I mean, there are more and more people show their mistrust or distrust with mainland China. More and more people worry about their future to making business with Chinese government after this One Belt, One Road. But I mean, from the Chinese side, it's very frustrating, right? I mean, because they try to show their effort to try to make balanced relationship or good relationship with other countries, but it always gets a counterproductive result from the other side. So much work still to work on. I mean, of course, there's still some misunderstandings existing between China and other countries. Especially, I think most of people concerned about the regime type right now. Chinese government represented. It's not a democratic party. It's not a democratic regime. So that's kind of an image actually influence a lot of people's attitude or positions or suspicions about Chinese intention to doing business or to have good relationship with those. Well, I mean, with their people, with different countries. So I think a regime type kind of one key issue here. And I don't know how to answer your question, but I just kind of, you just remind me some observations that I noticed. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dennis Halpin. I'm from the U.S. Korea Institute at SAIS. I had, you had said in discussing the American election, Beijing is waiting and watching. You said you thought Hillary Clinton had a good chance to get elected, which, yeah, I can't imagine Donald Trump being elected. But my question is to do with actually what I hear from my children, Bernie Sanders, millennial voters. If Hillary Clinton's elected, I was wondering what your interlocutors were saying. I mean, the presumption of some of the Bernie Sanders millennial voters is that Hillary Clinton is a hawk. She's much more confrontational than President Obama, who's somewhat confrontational adverse. They look at her statements with Young Jae-chul in Hanoi, on the freedom of navigation during ASEAN. They look at her statement in January 2013 with the Japanese foreign minister, and she was about to step down, where she said the Senkaku Islands are under the administration of Japan and they're covered by the Mutual Defense Treaty. Now, I'm not saying I agree with this, but the criticism of the Bernie Sanders young voters who are resistant to voting for Hillary Clinton is that she will have a Margaret Thatcher Iron Lady approach. As the first woman in office, she won't want to back down. And as you know, Margaret Thatcher sank that destroyer, Argentine destroyer, in the Falkland War. So did your interlocutors say, if we presume Hillary Clinton is elected president, did anyone mention they think there could be a more confrontational face down between the United States and China than there has been during the Obama administration?
Thank you very much for your question. It's very important. I think you are right. You are absolutely right. And I kind of hear the similar observations from some of my interviewees. The observation regarding how the new government, I mean the Clinton government, actually will play a much more tough, aggressive China policy compared with that of that in current Obama administration. I think you're right. That is expected, right? So I think because I just bought a book published by Carl Campbell. He's kind of one of the very important national security or Asia security advisor to Hillary Clinton, right? He just published a new book about pivot to Asia, and he described how he and Clinton talk about this idea, comes out this idea of the important role of Asia, and we can read the book to see more details. But I mean, originally this plan, I mean, pivot to Asia or rebalancing policy, I think was a good idea. Originally, it was a good idea that try to remind the United States, to put more resources from Middle East to make a balanced resources from Middle East to Asia, because in Asia, not only China but those Asia countries, South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, and so on. I mean, they are promising rising countries in Asia, especially in terms of the economic sense. So that's a good policy originally. But in the end, unfortunately, it was perceived by many people as a policy targeting on China's rising power, equal as containment policy perceived by many Chinese IR scholars. So I think the key point is those national security advisors to Hillary Clinton, if Hillary Clinton elected, I mean those security advisors, they need to continue to provide good advices, to if actually Clinton herself is much more assertive, then his advisors should pull her back to a kind of a middle way, to a more balanced way, to have more dialogue and communication. So that's the reason why I mentioned about personalized relationship between two countries will be very important. So high-level ranking officials communication is very important between the two countries. They need to continue to do that. But I think that point missing in current Obama administration, right? According to one of my interviews, told me that right now the Obama government actually compared with that in George W. Bush, the period, doesn't have this smooth or closed high-ranking official communication between the two countries. I think that's missing in the current administration. Maybe I'm wrong, but that kind of information I was told by one of my interviewees. So I think building up the mutual relationship between the two countries through the personalized channels will be quite important. I mean, to clarify those misunderstandings, to show their goodness with each other, to have more cooperations. Yeah, so that's kind of the way to prevent the possible harsh policy from if the new government in the United States. And it's kind of a possible way to prevent that tragedy happening. Yeah.
Several of these last questions go back to your response on the question that Nadia Tal raised about patience. So I'd like your reaction to the point that I would like to raise is that patience depends on the situation, the ability to maintain patience.
Yes.
I think your example of Cuba and contrasting it with Iraq needs more analysis.
Yeah.
Cuba, now that we had gotten through the Cuban Missile Crisis and we were not facing that kind of situation, was not a threat, basically. It was a highly contentious political issue in the United States, but it was not a threat to basic U.S. interests. At least that's not my impression. I think what happened in the Middle East potentially was. I mean, a lot of people thought there was a nuclear threat involved, and then the whole stability of the Middle East, which is viewed in the United States as of central strategic importance to the United States. And the same thing could be said about Asia, that the whole reason for the pivot or rebalance was because there was a sense, which some people don't agree with, but there was a sense that the U.S. had not engaged sufficiently in the region where its economic, political, diplomatic, and security interests were deeply engaged and were going to be for the foreseeable future as far as you wanted to look. And so the perception of many people was that what China did in terms of creating these artificial islands was in fact to raise a potential security threat to U.S. interests. And so there was the island building, there was the construction on the islands, and then there's the whole question now of militarization or not. So as you look at the question of patience, do you see a difference in the ability or even the desirability of maintaining patience depending on the nature of the situation and whether it in fact, if you're just looking at the U.S., whether it in fact is seen as posing a potential threat to vital U.S. interests?
Thank you very much. It's very tough. It's really a tough question. I think you are right. It depends on the situation, right? But in my mind, I think it also depends on one's willingness to use one's capability, to solve the problem immediately or in the short term or not. So it basically rely on the policymaker, especially the leaders of the country, the leaders of the party in China, both in China and the United States, to decide if they want to use this capacity immediately or not. So for example, you mentioned about maybe there's much more deep analysis between Cuba and Middle East, between Iraq. But if my information is correct, I know Donald Rumsfeld actually was accused of making up the story about Iraq. Actually, the country, finally we found that does not have mass destruction weapons. So, I mean, he kind of, Rumsfeld kind of refused to say he knew this in advance, but I think probably people in Pentagon, I'm not sure, but if people in Pentagon actually knew that Iraq does not have this mass destruction weapon before they launch a war with Iraq, actually they just lose their patience to decide to do that. And so that's kind of attention, always attention to, but of course for their own reasons and for their own interest, to want to respond immediately. And as you can see from the Chinese side, I think that's kind of, I mean, it's always depending on the judgment of the decision makers, whether they want to exercise their power or capacity to deal with specific positions, a specific situation, right? So it's always the judgment about the decision makers. And so far we can see from the Chinese side, even if you mention about these artificial islands, as you know that the Chinese side, they also have excuse because they are not the first country to do artificial islands. Actually, that's Philippines or Vietnam. They had artificial island first. So that kind of pushed China to respond in an equal way. But I mean, as far as we have observed from the Chinese government behaviors, for example, in the beginning, they mentioned about putting aside issues, putting aside disputes, and have a commonly construction 各自争议共同开发。This is kind of a solution or a solution of patience policy, to try to ignore the unsolved issues. So they just focus on this 共同开发的 common development issues, to waiting for and to kind of avoid the sensitive political sovereignty issues. So I mean that's kind of an example to show you. But they may change their policy. So for example, right now many people observe that Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, has very different personality. That means he probably will not like Deng Xiaoping or Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao. I mean those people who has much patience about South China Sea, has more patience about Taiwan issue. So it always depends on the judgment on Xi Jinping, for example, the judgment on the new government, for example, Hillary Clinton, rely on their judgment. They want to have more patience to wait for better conditions to come or not. Yeah. So the judgment also includes what you mentioned about the situation. Yeah.
No more questions. Oh, I come back.
One quick question.
Wait till you get the microphone, please.
Just one
The question from all this interview, anybody offer you a more, optimistic view? What's the reason? Because this sounds so pessimistic. Anything that can brighten the future.
I think one or two people express optimistic view with certain conditions. So they would say, as long as Chinese government to change its behavior, as long as Xi Jinping changes assertive about it, as long as the party reform itself, or as long as the Chinese government become democratic party one day, they have many conditions. But to be honest, but some people they will be very neutral, or they some people they just neutral. They don't talk about pessimistic or optimistic. But most of people I interviewed, they just answer that they have this pessimistic view. And for those resources and reasons, you can refer to the two articles I just mentioned to you. Actually, one is book, Harry Harting's new article, and David Shenbou's new book about China's future. Those two pieces, actually, they can give you much more information. How people here in Washington, D.C., they have this worry, and where is this worry coming from? I mean, what's the resources for this pessimism? So that's the part I didn't mention in my presentation today. But I mean, the time point is most kind of counted from 2010 or 2001. That's kind of a perceived rising power from China and the declining power from the United States. So that's kind of a perceived power change between the two countries. Among those think tanks or scholars here in Washington, D.C.
Any more questions? Please.
I'm Stanley Kober. So far we've been focused almost entirely on East Asia, which is somewhat understandable. But today the news is about a terrorist bombing of the Chinese embassy in Kyrgyzstan. When the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union disintegrated. Who expected that the United States would be involved in a war in Afghanistan extending for years? That's where we are. Are we looking in the wrong place for China's future security threats?
Thank you very much. It's another tough question. To some extent, I think the answer is yes. I think the current U.S. grand strategy in the world is kind of we call this a self-prophecy theory. I mean, the result is what you cost actually, because you have bad policy. So I mean the bad result is because of your bad policy, your bad grand strategy from the United States. I don't try to blame the government, especially I'm right now here, but it's very impolite to say so. But I think it's wrong in terms of to many people who have this bad memory about Western powers, especially those people who in Asia, they have this probably through education system. They have this bad memory about World War II, about how Western powers, since that Qing dynasty, to intervene domestic politics, people suffering a lot from the Western powers, even if it's from the good intention from the Western side, such as human rights issues, to try to promote certain so-called good values or good policy, good norms. But for some people in Asia, especially most of the people who I know in mainland China, they don't like these universal values applied to Asia. So that's the reason why they try to promote this idea to respect each other's sovereignty. But what they really want to say is to respect each other's cultural history and different philosophical thinking systems and so on. So I think that's the main point. The reason why most Chinese people they cannot accept or they perceive any goodness from United States would be as a kind of intervention in their life, in their political systems. So if you go to China, you ask those people if they are satisfied with the current regime type, I think most people would say yes. And I believe that some of them actually speak from their heart. So because they have this memory of histories, so these kind of universal values systems kind of cannot be acceptable in some countries like China. I don't know if I answer your question or not, but it's really a complicated question to talk about the potential confrontation between not only between China and the United States, but between many countries in Asia and the Western countries actually.
You have provided us with a lot of food for thought, and I want to thank you. And I want to thank everybody here for coming.
Thank you very much.